One point worth making about all this data is that almost all of it comes from people filling in forms, and we don't like forms and red tape. So there's a paradox there as well.
Yeah, I have to say that Glasgow University, I occasionally get a form like once a month that asks me to specify in detail where I spend my week in terms of hours. And the breakdown of those hours. And I got a bit pissed off with it. And then I discovered that when I sent a return in once where I said I worked 180 hours that week, that there was no comeback on that, so I just sent that form in for the last 16 occasions. Probably significantly skews the average
Allan, could I just point out that if you operated in the kind of slightly different entrepreneurial regime that Ian referred to earlier on, if, for example, you were a lawyer, you would not find anything unusual about ticking off how many minutes, how many hours you were working, because you would be billing a client who would be saying to you, I don't believe this. Itemize it. You and I, until recently, had the fortune to draw in a salary every month through BAC, regardless of what I had done. I'm sure you worked 108 hours a week and still do.
I'm putting the kind of points together. About a month ago, I ran an enterprise away day for a local authority. And part of the exercise was actually putting people through what it would be like to start their own business. And we gave them some challenges. And we then applied that to their authority. What came out of that was that the majority of participants switched from acting entrepreneurially for a customer, for a client, and they filtered in, I think it was the Scotland Act, which talked about best value for procurement. And they said, oh, no, because we've got to use Sodexo because they're best value for procurement. And then actually one of the people challenged that and they said, that's not what the Act says at all. It says that's part of it. But what you've now got is an entire institution procuring on the basis of a potential misinterpretation of an act, and nobody set out to challenge that. That's where, I think Douglas's point about the statistics, the unreliability, but that's what's happening. We are actually now working in a way that is counter to economic good, because there's things like that happening.
Thanks so much. Could we have another question, please?
Hi, David Oxford from Highland Science Enterprise. It's a bit of a personal question. Does the abolition of the regional development authorities in England give an opportunity for Scotland to attract inward investment internationally?
I didn't pick that up.
Could you repeat the question?
Sorry, the abolition of the English RDAs, does that give Scotland an opportunity to attract international inward investors?
I'd say self-evidently it does, it has to. Scotland was already, through HIE and Scottish Enterprise, it's the presence of SDI, was already at an advantage, recognised advantage, over the regions of England in terms of attracting inward investment, and has been the model for a lot of them trying to pick up the pace. And to abolish them, of course, creates an opportunity for a very different type of foreign direct investment environment, and SDI has had to respond to that anyway, I guess. But don't underestimate the power of a shock to the system. And you know, the English have been challenged to fill that vacuum, private sector in particular, and some of them may do so very well. You know, we shouldn't be complacent about continuing to have a structure which has served us relatively well for quite a long time when things are changing very, very fast around us.
Any other thoughts on that?
I defer to those of you in the audience who know far more about inward investment than I do, but I recall when I was a councillor in Edinburgh that we often talked a great deal about inward investment and incentives and how that operated. Why was that relevant to Edinburgh? Well, because an awful lot of inward investment, particularly of manufacturing and process, went into Livingston, which had the key advantage for inward investors and executives there that they could live in a nice place and recruit employees somewhere else. And in that sense, it was a suburban operation. What I think we need to think very hard about is whether any longer those kind of mobile, we will attract them in by giving them large amounts of money, are, first of all, are they the kind of activities we want to encourage in? And secondly, how do you reconcile that with Ian's very good point, to me very good point, about generating higher value and intellectual property in a society where we should, by many accounts, be well equipped to do this through education, along with the processes of manufacturing. I mean, you know, to a large extent, everything we have sitting in front of us here, I suspect, with the possible exception of this bottle, our factories are now in China, Philippines, Vietnam, so on. So I'm not sure about the inward investment and whether it will change or not. I suppose time will tell.
I think the point that supply chains have changed radically has to be taken on board in any thinking about how inward investment may be changing in the future. And I take comfort to a certain extent from developments like the Amazon factory opening up. Because at the end of the day, whereas it may be the case that we will have a more entrepreneurial culture, which would be a good thing, it would be unrealistic to expect that everyone is going to be picked up on that wave. Therefore, and there are a lot of people who are going to be looking for jobs that are not necessarily high-skilled jobs. And if we can find a niche within the new configuration of global supply chains, like Amazon, then I think that's all to the good. But, you know, these opportunities may be few and far between.
Thanks, Ian.
There's a short-term opportunity because there are businesses that have been negotiating with regional development agencies, and that has come to an abrupt halt in the middle of negotiation. There's a long-term threat because the new model and it is a new model in England that is coming out, is going to be very different and much more. Well, I don't know if it will work, but what we do know is we cannot carry on doing what we're doing without refreshing our thinking. So short-term opportunity, long-term substantial threat. Because the English model may turn out to be massively more attractive. I don't know if the local enterprise partnerships will work, but the focus, and Heseltine was round touring everybody and saying, private sector must lead, private sector must lead. Whether that will happen, we don't know. But it is going to have a major impact on the kind of offering and the style of support and negotiations. It could actually take work away from Scotland.
My question's very similar to the one we've just had around England setting up its new enterprise zones, offering financial incentives and reducing planning regulations. And I was just wondering if the panel feels that Scotland needs to put something in place to remain competitive against these English enterprise zones.
Of course, if you got control of corporation tax, then you would just bring it down to whatever level enterprise zones are going to have. Whether that will happen or not is a moot point. Then, of course, you've got to be a little careful because some of the research, which I'm dimly recalling, I don't know if I'm right, Allan, indicated that much of the enterprise zone activity was a redistribution of existing.
Quite short distances.
Yeah, so they just moved over the border and took advantage of that. So I don't think it's something necessarily that we should worry too much about.
Any other thoughts, next question? Yes.
Well, there is a plan, so far a little noticed, but they'll have to do something about it at some point in the next 5 years. The SNP manifesto promised 4 enterprise zones. They didn't specify what the powers would be. They didn't say where they would be or how they would be selected. It was a fair bet until the 5th of May that one of them would be in Murray, particularly if this, well, we know there's going to be one air base closed there, and it's an area with very low wages anyway, with big transport problems. Interesting political question, though. That was an element of pork barrel expected to look after a safe area for the SNP. But of course, everywhere is now for the pork barrel for the SNP. And there's an awful lot of marginal seats, far more marginal than Murray, that they will want to protect. So it's an interesting challenge for the new administration.
Was there not mention of Inverclyde in the last couple of days?
Yeah, I wouldn't be terribly surprised if Inverclyde got a bit of a mention. Yeah.
What's they used to have?
They did. Yeah.
Avoid them like the plague. Oh, there's no, I mean, everybody in England say, what on earth are we doing enterprise zones for? They failed before. So that's the first point. And the second thing, it's a cop-out because it stops local authorities taking on a complete overview of the whole thing. It's yet something that silos it, well, what's left of economic development off into another area.
Well, for me, there's a number of different elements come together, both in your specific question and the general proposition, and that is the interrelationship between regulatory control, i.e. planning consent, building consent, access to infrastructure such as water supplies and so on. And it relates to the inward investment question as well, which is goes beyond the enterprise zone, i.e. the reduction in taxation that might be available. I mean, after all, the evidence from a number of major companies shows that corporation tax, rather like inheritance tax, is a wee bit voluntary. You know, if you're a smart company, you don't pay corporation tax at the headline level. Maybe you should do, but you don't. But the other factor is what is the future of our economy going to look like? What is the future of a variety of infrastructural activities going to look like? And it turns upon things like, where do we locate the next generation of refuse disposal activities, including furnacing and incineration? Will it be those authorities that are willing to go along with a relaxation on planning consents and are willing to face down their populations about locating something there which is not in 5, 10, 15 years' time, is not going to be anything like the smoke and dirt belching kit we had before, because we live in I view both government and ourselves as a society have many, many internal conflicts and discussions. We want to enhance the environment for our children and grandchildren, yet we really rather like taking a cheap flight at threepence to Tenerife.